Hello, family. Hello to all those Scots and to all those Gales out there. Man, here we are at the Hippodrome from the glory days of the old Jackson Ward, which had a nickname of being the Harlem of the South, where the great legends of music, song, and dance would come to Richmond on the Chitlin Circuit and perform as they on their way to Atlanta, Georgia, and points south. We had a great weekend, great hugs and kisses, and a lot of tears of joy as the families are reunited. And to have this Gale Scott and other clans to come back to Richmond, haven't had left Richmond years before. The reunion was held at the Hippodrome, and I'm excited to give this family history presentation to try to bring a little bit of light to the history of the family. First, let me start off with a little few maintenance things that help us along. Nothing I'm showing here is intended to be perfect, so please don't think so. I did not intend it for it to be perfect. So if you feel compelled to disagree, just understand you didn't read this slide closely. Always view family history from 30,000 feet. That's the way the Savior looks at us from above. We can get tied into knots trying to see things at ground level when it comes to family history. Also, understand that life is nothing but birth and death. That's all there is to life. Everything else in between are events. And these events can and should be remembered, or if we choose to, they can be forgotten. But most importantly, they can be celebrated. But if you really have to, they can be forgotten. And lastly, I think the greatest thing to understand is to gain a perspective. If you could find a mother and a father for every mother and every father for 14 generations back, you will discover that over 32,000 people made you. You don't stand alone. You are the legacy of a whole lot of people, the hopes and dreams and aims of a lot of people that have gone over before you. Many of them under very tough circumstances, but yet they lived, survived, and thrived so that you could live. Always remember that. Your ancestors are very important to you. So now let's get started here with this photograph of Kane Avenue Baptist Church, which most of you should be familiar with. And we're going to talk about Joseph Andrew Gales and Mary Lou Scott. Great place to start because that's where this history for us before and after comes to a point that it's the pivotal point of why we're here in Richmond for this celebration of a family reunion. You can see there's the birth and death dates of Mary and Joseph, and they were married in 1904, and they were married in Camden, New Jersey. And of course, we know that the story of the families are that they migrated, and that migration brought about a separation, or a diaspora, if you want to call it that. And we're going to talk a little bit about that migration and separation. And it seems to start around 1900. Joseph Gale, he was 16, living in Henderson, North Carolina. By 1910, in 10 years, Joseph, now 27, had moved to Camden, New Jersey, and with him was a wife, Mary Lou Scott Gales, Bernicia, a daughter, and Myrtle, a daughter. Also living with them was a William and Lena Scott. Uncle William Scott, obviously, brother to Mary Lou Gales. They had one son, Roland. But for me, the real identifier, the real point of where the diaspora began, or was, should I say, solidified, was in 1914. The home place, 1030 St. Peter Street, was sold to James Scott. And here's a record of that from the newspaper of 1914. It shows where Mary Lou Gales sold the property to James D. Scott, her brother. And again, that happened November the 10th, 1914, St. Peter Street property. Along with that, signing off was Rebecca Scott. And she too signed off the property to James D. Scott on the same date. This is not the exact house, but this is a house from the period that was 3 streets over in the same numbered block, 1000 block. That was 1001 St. James, and the family place was at 1030 St. Peter. But this gives you an idea of what things may have looked like back in 1914 when the property was being sold. And there was a huge area of Richmond that looked like this, and it was called Shockoe Hill, and a part of another section called Apostle Town, or as people would call it, Postletown. And the city decided what they called an urban experiment that ran from 1942 to 1957. Wiped out, demolished all those homes, about 600 or better homes were totally wiped out. And built in its place was this development called Gilpin Court. Took out St. Peter Street. St. Peter Street, I believe, is going to be just at the end, in the middle of this picture to the left, is where 1030 St. Peter Street more than likely was found. But anyhow, the Gilpin Court area is still standing. It's a city-owned public housing facility, and this was the first in the city back then, and they've experimented with several more like this in the city. But along with the urban experiment, if you will, the brighter minds of Virginia and Richmond, along with the federal government, agreed to build a highway system from Richmond to Petersburg, and eventually it was merged into Interstate 95. And here you can see the construction of Interstate 95, again, where many, many more houses were demolished. That church you see there is 6 Mount Zion Baptist Church. That church and its history caused the highway to be bent and to go around the church. Ideally, the interstate was going to wipe out that church and a lot of other historic properties that now exist. And the reason for that, there was a famous minister, John Jasper. He preached a sermon, The Sun Do Move, and it created quite a stir in the black and white communities, and he was invited all over to re-preach that same sermon, The Sun Do Move. And in fact, Abraham Lincoln sent a delegation to Richmond to hear John Jasper give that sermon, The Sun Do Move. But further into our effort to understand this migration, I found this certificate of marriage, Mason Gales and Susan Amos. They were the parents of Joseph Andrew Gales, who married Mary Louise Scott. And you can see that the marriage took place in Granville, North Carolina, and that happened on 25 March 1868. And that established this family group. This family group sheet here at the bottom, highlighted there, is Joseph Andrew Gales, is the one who we are celebrating this weekend, and his parents. Again, from the marriage certificate from Granville, North Carolina, we see Mason Gales and his wife, Susan Amos. And further digging, we found that Mason Gales was the son of a Ned Gales and a Ketty Gales. Don't know her real last name, her birth name, but she was Ketty. And Joseph's mother, Susan, their parents were Browen A., and he carried the nickname Sam. Sam Amos, and Lucy, and don't have any record of her last name. But further to that group, they had the following children. George, found that George lived and died in the Raleigh, North Carolina area. He was married, but he had no children. Then there was a Mason Jr. Could not find very little information about him, and little's known, and I suspect that he died at an early age. Then there was a Luther. Luther lived in the Henderson, North Carolina area. He was married and had 7 children. And then a daughter, Betty. Betty also lived in the Henderson, North Carolina area, and she was married, had 10 children. And we were happy to have Alice with us at the celebration this weekend, and she's one of those 10 kids of Betty, so we were so glad to have her here. Then Indiana, interesting name and spelling, but little was known about her as well, and she too may have died at an early age. And then another daughter, Lucy, little known about her. I ran across several Lucy Gales. They were all white. Birth information didn't really match. So I'm saying right now I know a little about her, about Lucy. And then, of course, the last child was Joseph, the one who temporarily lived with someone else in Carolina, not with his parents, and then he moved on to New Jersey. This is kind of a tree look at Joseph Gales. There's Joseph at the bottom, highlighted in yellow, and his father was Mason. His parents were Ned and Katie, as I explained earlier. And looking at Joseph again, looking at his mother, and his mother had a brother named Gessie. Don't know if that meant to be Jesse, but it's showing up as Gessie. And her parents were, again, Browan or Sam Amos and Lucy Amos, and found his mother even further, Fanny. Worthy of more research for sure. Then we come to Mary Lou, again, the wife of the family to which we are celebrating this weekend. Mary Lou was a child of Joseph H. Scott and Anne Rebecca Robinson. His parents were Joseph H. Scott, and Mary Scott. And from that union, they had children, another Mary Scott. Of course, we had James H., a Josephine Scott, and a Joseph Scott Jr., or the second. And some of them we have information on, but not a lot. And as I was preparing for this, I got notice of a potential match for Joseph H. Scott's parents. And we were hoping that, grandparents, Joe Scott's parents. And this family is coming out of Tennessee. I don't want to verify yet till I do some checking, and the only way I can check it is I do have some Scotts from the Tennessee, Ohio area that match me DNA-wise. So I'm going to have to trace their trees and see if they trace back up to this new potential father there in green. And hopefully in a few weeks I can report that they are, and we have further insight to where our family comes from. Back to Anne Rebecca. Anne Rebecca, of course, was married to James H. Scott, and they had all the children below there that you can see. And Anne Rebecca's family consisted of a Henry Robinson and a Martha Butler. Officially, I can tell you that they were, as they call, free issue. Matter of fact, couple of my aunts and my Uncle Mel would always say that she would say that she was a free issue. They got to see her, but she lived a long life, and Rebecca did. And she would always say that she was a free issue. And the census records indicated they were on the census records of Negroes of free issue. Have an indication of Martha's father, another butler. Henry Robinson's family got good leads on, particularly the mother, Margaret Kestner. And these Kestners are also from the Tennessee, Ohio area. So a lot of things was going on back there in the 1870s, mid 1870s. And I have yet to do additional research on those two. But back to James and Rebecca and the kids that they have there. And we will try to take a peek at each one of them. The first was Caroline. Caroline did live in Richmond, but her fate is unclear. Cannot quite figure out if she was married, children, where she died. So still digging, trying to find Caroline. Second daughter was Pocahontas. She lived in Richmond. I'm saying that her fate is unclear. There are several Pocahontases listed in the Richmond records, if you will, most of which are showing white or the age just doesn't match. So at this point, I'm just saying that I got to do more research to determine what she's like. James Delaney Scott, which is my great-grandfather, and he's pretty much the root of everything that stayed here in Richmond when the others migrated. Charles died at age 7. Ira, not a lot known about Ira, but it looks like he may have been a twin to Ada. And we'll talk about Ada in a little bit, but not certain about this Ira Scott. Cannot find a lot of information on him. And then lastly, the last one, Luther Scott, and he passed away at age 4. Then we have to talk about the migration. And these were the ones who migrated north. They escaped the horrors of Richmond, if you will, go north for freedom during the Industrial Revolution of the early 1900s to like 1915. And we go explore just a little bit more about that migration. The first to go to migrate was Ada Scott. She was likely the first, and she eventually married and had one child. You can see here she's living with a family called Wilson. She's a servant, even though she's listed as white. The births kind of match what we know, and it also indicates that she was from Virginia. Her father was from Virginia, and her mother was from Virginia. So that's enough for me to say, bingo, we got to connect. So I'm thinking Ada was the first to move to Ohio, and this is in 1900. I'm sorry, not Ohio, to New Jersey. To New Jersey. The next record we show of Ada Scott is she's now married to a Howard Johnson. And the reason I can confirm that is if you look at the last name, that's Mary Scott. Birth dates match as well as the ancestral information there matches. So Mary Scott now in 1905 is living with Ada and her husband Howard. Susan is Howard's mother. And I found that interesting. I guess seemed once you get established, you turn around and reach out and help the other family lift up, and I think that's what we see here. Keep in mind, by 1910, Mary was married with at least 2 kids. We talked about that earlier. Next was George D. Scott. He migrated north after he went through a divorce, had one child here, and migrated north, went to New Jersey. I'm certain but may not have stayed that long. Went to New York. He was following the construction. And here's a record. Now he's in New Jersey in 1915, and he's married to Rosanna. And Rosanna, I think, was from the New York area. So in 1915. And here's a record of his death. He died in Detroit, actually. And interesting on the death certificate, it mentions labor pneumonia. So evidently working in the cold, chilly weather of the Detroit area, he probably contracted pneumonia and he died. But the record indicates his Douglas, and his middle name was Douglas, George Douglas Scott. His father is indicated as James and mother unknown. And I found that interesting. His wife, who was the informant of this record, Rosanna Scott, which matched other records. And also their street address matched some other records. I know that I got the correct Douglas Scott. Next, we'll talk about Mary Lou. We talked a little bit that she ended up in 1905 living with her sister Ada. And by 1910, she was married and had 2 kids. And here's a census record from 1910 where Joseph and Mary and 2 of the daughters, along with Uncle William and his wife Lena, and a son, Roland, all living in the same household there in New Jersey. Proceed on to 1920. 10 years later, Joseph and Mary, and now they got 3 children. And Uncle William, they have moved out. So, I'm sorry, Uncle George had moved out, and they got their household to themselves. If you look at the ancestral information there, Joseph is from North Carolina, as is his parents, and Mary from Virginia as her parents. Kind of indication of that we got the right family, but obviously with the names Bernicia, Myrtle, and Drusilla, we know we got the right family here. Aunt Julia also migrated north. She was married and had 3 kids in Richmond before they decided to move north, and she had 2 more kids in New Jersey. And she was married to William Woolfolk. His family was a well-known, well-established family in Richmond. So I'm curious what motivated him to go with Julia to New Jersey, but nevertheless, they did. They were there. And they had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kids. Like I mentioned, she had 3 of them here and the other 2 in New Jersey. Again, we're looking at 1930. Julia is now by herself, and it indicates that she's a widower. And she's continued to raising her own family. And she now has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 kids with her out of the 7. So somebody flew the nest. And lastly was Uncle William. Uncle William lived with Gale for a short while, and ended up having 7 children. Here he is in Richmond, 1910. He's married to his first wife. And then he's now with Lena in 1915, and they've got 3 kids. And lastly, Uncle William with Lena, and they've got 3 kids living with them, but at the bottom there you'll see Rebecca, which is Aunt Rebecca, the mother of William and Mary Lou and Julia and the others that moved to Camden. So evidently she spent some time up in Camden in the 1920s. Again, we're looking at Joseph H. Scott and Ann Rebecca Robinson. Of course, they had the 12 kids, and one of which was James Delaney Scott. So I'm kind of explaining my line a little bit so y'all can be familiar with the Richmond Scotts. And he was married to a Fanny Turrell. They had 3 children. One died at birth, one died about 4 years of age, and the remaining child living was Othello, which is my grandfather. And he married a Rebecca White. And these are their children. Leah Marie, we call her Marie. Oldest child, she stirred up a lot of things, but they were glad she got out the house because she stirred up so much. But anyhow, she married during World War II, and her husband took on a job in the steel mills up in outside of Pittsburgh in a place in Newcastle, and they never had any kids. 2018, she passed away, and she was 103 when she passed. Othello Jr., we call him Bruh or Uncle Bruh. He lived here in Richmond all his life, here in Richmond. Married, had 3 kids, one of which was Buddy, which is Othello III, Buddy, the one who talks about the flying. And then cousin Pat, who was also at the reunion with her family. And then, of course, cousin Carolyn, who's no longer with us, but we'll talk about her in a minute. And Uncle Bro was very good with his hands. He was a very good bricklayer, carpenter. He could master a lot of trades. He was very good at what he did. Then there was Uncle Clarence. He died at age 14. I mentioned at the presentation in Richmond that we grew up with the thinking that he got hit with a baseball bat, but we think that was a cover story to help Grandma deal with his loss, because he had rushed in the house one day after playing baseball, grabbed a glass of water and drank it, and what he thought was H2O was H2SO4, a cleaning compound that was used back in those days. Grandma had set aside to spot her clothes when she was ironing, and it deteriorated his internal organs for a while, and he lingered for a few years, then he eventually died. So that's Clarence B. Scott. And here she is, the queen, Aunt Beulah. Aunt Beulah affected everybody's life. She cared for us all. She fed us, made sure we were dressed, and she wouldn't hesitate to pull off those flip-flop shoes and fan your handy in a moment. But she was good to us. She did a lot to help the other brothers and sisters raised our own children. Then there was James D. Scott. He died at age 4. Aunt Elma lived in Richmond for a short while, finished school here, but then she met her husband and they moved up to Beaver Falls. He was not in the steel mill, but I think he was from that area originally. Maybe that's what it was. But Marie was up there, so she kind of went up there to be with Marie as well. So she was married, had 1 kid. Everybody loved him. His name was Poogie. We couldn't wait for summertime to have Poogie come down and stay with us for the summer. Then there's my dad, Russell F. He had 3 sons. I'm the youngest. My 2 brothers are deceased. Miss them a lot. But life goes on, right? And then probably the most talented of all the kids was Uncle Mel. He was not only good with his hands, but he was a thinker and very articulate. He offered a lot to the family, gave a lot of help, and he raised 1 daughter and 3 sons. Lost 1, Mark, a few years ago, and recently lost Michael. And Michael was very special to the family in his own way. So we do miss Mike. And let's kind of repeat there. Sorry about that. Just very briefly, don't want to get too far in the weeds with this, but this is just a chart indicating connections DNA-wise. You see Joseph Joe Scott gave birth to a son of James H. Scott. And James H. had three children, James Delaney, Mary Lou, and Aunt Julia. And James Delaney, within that tree, I have three definitive DNA matches, a clear indication that everybody under James Delaney is kin. Mary Lou, I have two direct hits, Robin Heath as well as Naima Stone. Again, connecting all the Watsons and the Gales, right on up to Mary Lou, to confirm that we are definitely kin. And the same thing with Aunt Julia, connected with a Joyce Duckett, and again connecting us all as family, DNA wise. Here's a birth record, which I really wish I could make clear. This is a birth record registry of Mary Lou Scott, and I'm sorry the print's off, but I want to at least show you the record, and it's there for us to have and to enjoy. This record's kind of special to me. It's called an index of marriages. It's not the actual marriage certificate or marriage record. It's an index. And on that index, I found three sisters on the same index. And I found that very interesting, to have such a record. Well, all three sisters showing the date that they were wedded to their respective husbands. Someone passed this on to me. I have no idea where it came from, but it's out of the old Woodlawn Cemetery, which is pretty much grown over now. I had never seen this stone before till someone sent it to me, but I know it's my great-grandfather, because the death date matches, and the key there is that Trinity Baptist Choir, Trinity Baptist Church Choir, and in the legacy of our side of the family, James D. belonging to Ebenezer Baptist, where we worshiped Sunday, left Ebenezer to go to Trinity because he wanted to meet and hook up with Fanny Turrell. And eventually they did, and I guess they stayed in Trinity Baptist for the remainder of their lives. Just another little bit of history here. We have a news article from 1918. Before 1914, we see where now James Delaney has paid off the debt on 1030 St. Peter Street. Just to have a little fun, Richmond newspaper used to take somewhat glee, I guess, in using words like Negro and emphasize or the misadventures of the black community, and that they would print articles with murders and whatnot to just cast a dark shadow over us as a people. And here's an article where it talks about two Negroes did some murders and some other things. Rather lengthy article. And down in the middle of the article, they decide to talk about my Uncle Bruh, but his father and mother, and called him a Negro delivery boy at age 24. Negro boy. And that's how things kind of worked back in those days. I guess that was the system. But it indicated where he was robbed, and I'm going to just leave that up just for a few seconds longer so y'all can read that. But it's just kind of ironic, you know, they use things like Negro and boy, and they put it down into an article about murder. So it just kind of like they want to wrap it all in misery, fear, and degradation. So but we had some good things too to talk about. Sports and tennis were part of our lives, and Here you can see this is Buddy, cousin Buddy, Othello the third, playing tennis, and he defeated and won his round of tennis here, which was reported in the Richmond paper. This is back from 1957, and tennis was kind of popular in our neighborhood during those times. And here you can see Johnny Ash, which is a brother of Arthur Ashe. He also playing in the boys level, where Buddy was in the juniors. But this is one of my favorite pieces, so I can talk about cousin Buddy. The article went on to say that Buddy took a whipping on the tennis course. So I just had to share that, rub that into him. If you read that in the second paragraph, Peyton teamed with Savinius Peyton to take the doubles crown, whipping Massenburg and Othello Scott. Look at those scores, 10-8 and 6-2. That was a whipping. Here's one of our cherished memories in the family. Our cousin Carolyn, which is sister to Buddy and Patricia Scott, daughter of Bruce Scott, Othello II. Carolyn was a very active, busy young lady growing up all through school. And here she's being talked about as a cheerleader for the Philadelphia Eagles. And she was in that small bevy of black women to become the first cheerleaders in the NFL. So we were pretty proud of that fact. And it was a pretty sad day when we lost Carolyn, because she kind of left a hole in the family. She was a bright star in all the family. She could always think of a joke to share and tell. And but anyhow, that's Carolyn. So we got some light in our family tree. Talk briefly about some kin folks that, believe it or not, they were active Republicans. Mainly, this was Peter Woolfolk. He ended up running for city council for the city of Richmond. I'm sorry, this is Peter Woolfolk. Peter is the father of William Woolfolk, who married Aunt Julia. And he ran for city council. And the Woolfolk family was very well placed in Richmond. They were tied in a lot of ways, not politically and financially, into the Black Wall Street. So, again, I didn't understand why they decided to move to New Jersey. But anyhow, that's a little history. So we got some political intrigue in our family. But also found some political intrigue up in New Jersey. So when the colored Republicans had their meetings, somebody like Joseph Gale used to say the prayers. And he was actually vice president of this group, what they call the 7th Ward Colored Republican Club, is what it was called. So Joseph Gale's evidently had his hands in a lot of things. It looks like politics and church and family. So obviously he was a good man. One of my treasures, I've got this vacuum sealed and put away because I don't want it to deteriorate any more than it had. But this is a record, Othello Sr. Mother, Fanny Turrell, married to James D. Scott, the guy on Tombstone, the one who went over to Trinity. She kept this Bible, and she made notations in of a lot of things about births and deaths, etc. And this is what started me on my track. This is where I actually started my search for family history. And I'm ever grateful for Fanny. She'll get a good hug from me when I get to heaven for having put me on this right track to search out family. Again, there's some more information on another page, and I couldn't take too many pages because the Bible is very delicate and it's falling apart. I don't pull it out. Very rare will I ever pull it out because it's just that delicate. You can note there on this page at the top left, they knew Mary Lou Gales at 757 Cherry Street. So some of you in Camden, New Jersey might recognize that address. Unfortunately, some of us has a hard time. Joseph Gale's father evidently ran into some problems, and this is going to be, he's pretty much up in age now, but his property had to be sold off for debt. Further to the intrigue in families, um, it's interesting. There's an article that talks about Joseph Gale's arrested in war. And I'm like, what is that all about? It turns out he was charged for a parking violation. And the story goes on to read, and they give the address, Joseph Gale's 56 of 849 Cherry Street. He was charged $5, but the judge refunded him his $3. Evidently, there was some war going on about parking in front of the post office. I think that's the main reason for this. I'll leave it up just for a little bit for y'all to read. And the story must have been so good, they printed in another newspaper the next day. Almost the same thing, but they printed it twice. If you read at the bottom of the second one, very bottom, it says, Police Lieutenant Nathan Petty, in charge of the war, announced the drive against angle and long-time parking in the vicinity of the post office building. Boy, the things that we go after. But I found that interesting. Hopefully y'all will enjoy that. I think this is probably the last slide. I think this is really special. The Baptist Church, the Kane, I think you pronounce it Kane Avenue Baptist Church, honored Mary Lou Gales and Aunt Julia Woolfolk, among some others, as being Mothers of the Year for Mother's Day. So I think that's somewhat important. It was printed another week later, the same thing, recognizing the two of them along with some others being Mothers of the Year. So hopefully that's some good information that can be shared with you and you can share with others. We are family, this Scott and the Gales. I'm so happy to have an opportunity to do this. I will be doing continued research, and as things go on, I hope to share those things that I find with each and every one of you. I love y'all. Thanks so much for coming to Richmond. It really, really had an impact on me and my family. And I say these things with a lot of love. Thank you.